Welcome to the Dark Docket, where we delve into the most mysterious and supernatural legal cases in history. I'm your host, Aiden, and for our Season 1 finale, we are going to give you a double dose of spine-tingling paranormal precedents. Join us as we explore the chilling tales of the Greenbrier ghost and Gamble's ghost, two 19th century legal cases from West Virginia that allowed for spectral evidence to be introduced in court. Before we turn to the matter at hand, I need to share an important disclaimer. Nothing you hear on this show should be construed as legal advice. If you're facing a legal issue, please consult with a qualified attorney duly licensed in the appropriate state. Furthermore, while we strive for accuracy, we can't guarantee the complete historical validity of all facts and stories presented. Some details may be dramatized or simplified for narrative effect. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show, but remember, we're here to spark your imagination, not to solve your ghostly legal disputes. The date is June 22nd, 1897. The defendant, Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, also known as Edward Shue, stands accused of murdering his wife, Zona. But this was no ordinary murder trial. The star witness was arguably the victim's ghost. As the spectators file into the West Virginia courtroom, the air is thick with tension and whispered speculation. The prosecution, led by John Alfred Preston, is about to present a case that will challenge the very boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. In his opening statement, Preston lays out the basics of the case. On January 23, 1897, Zona Hester Shue was found dead at the foot of her stairs. Initially ruled as death by natural causes, the case took a chilling turn when Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, came forward with an incredible story. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. As the trial progresses, we'll unravel the events leading up to this moment, piece by eerie piece. The first witness called was Dr. George Knapp, the local physician who first examined Zona's body. Under questioning, Dr. Knapp revealed the unusual circumstances of his initial examination. When he arrived at the Shue residence, Edward Shue had already moved the body of his deceased wife. He had dressed her in a high-necked dress with a stiff collar. As Dr. Knapp attempted to examine the body, Shue's behavior became increasingly erratic. He cradled Zona's head, sobbing uncontrollably. When the doctor tried to look closer at some bruising on Zona's neck, Shue reacted so violently that Knapp hastily ended the examination. Initially, Dr. Knapp listed the cause of death as everlasting faint, later changing it to childbirth. It's worth noting that for 2 weeks prior to her death, Dr. Knapp had been treating Zona for what he termed female trouble. The next witness was Andy Jones, the young boy who discovered Zona's body. His testimony paints a vivid picture of what happened that day. Mr. Shue sent him to his house to check if Zona needed anything from the blacksmith shop where he worked. Edward had requested the boy to go to his home several times that day and was behaving impatiently. When Andy got there, he found Zona lying on the floor, unresponsive at the bottom of the stairs. Her eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness. As the boy stepped down, visibly shaken, the prosecution called a series of neighbors to the stand. Each added a piece to the puzzle of Zona's death and the events that followed. Mrs. Martha Jones, a neighbor, took the stand to describe how she helped prepare Zona's body for the wake. The day following the body's discovery, Zona was transported by carriage to her parents' home. Shue, showing what some considered extraordinary devotion, kept a vigil at the head of the open coffin, during the bumpy journey. The wake, held at the Hester home, lasted all day Sunday. It was during this time that Shu's behavior began to raise eyebrows among the mourners. Mrs. Jones testified that Shu's grief swung wildly between overwhelming sadness and manic energy. He allowed no one to get too close to the coffin, especially while he arranged a pillow on one side of Zona's head and a rolled-up cloth on the other. He claimed that these items would help Zona rest easier. Most notably, Shu tied a large scarf around Zona's neck, tearfully explaining that it had been her favorite. Mrs. Jones testified to the fact that she had never seen Zona wear the scarf before. When it came time to move the body to the cemetery, several people, including Mrs. Jones, noticed an unsettling looseness to Zona's head, as if it was not attached properly to her body. Next, the prosecution called John Hester, Zona's father, to testify about Shu's behavior at the wake. He described Shu's grief as not natural. One minute he'd be wailing, the next he'd be almost cheerful. He kept fussing with the scarf around Zona's neck, making sure no one touched it. And he wouldn't leave the coffin, not even for a moment. It was like he was guarding it. As the trial progressed, the prosecutor introduced evidence of Shu's troubled past and the fate of Shu's previous wives. His first wife, Allie Esteline Cutlip, divorced him in 1889 while he was in prison for horse theft. She alleged frequent abuse. His second wife, Lucy Ann Tritt, died under mysterious circumstances just 8 months after their marriage in 1894. Shu claimed she hit her head on a rock, but he fled the area before an investigation could be conducted. As shocking as these revelations were, they paled in comparison to what the prosecution's key witness was about to share. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, would make the courtroom fall truly silent. Mary Jane took the stand, her face a manifestation of grief, pain, and determination. Preston, the prosecutor, carefully questioned her about her suspicions following Zona's death, avoiding any mention of supernatural occurrences. Mary Jane said she knew something wasn't right, the way that Shu acted at the wake, the way he wouldn't let anyone near her, and the scarf he put around Zona's neck. She said Zona never liked things tight around her throat. Mary Jane then recounted a strange incident that occurred after the funeral. When she was washing the sheet from Zona's coffin, the water turned red. Then the sheet itself turned pink. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the mysterious stain out. She said it was like the sheet was trying to tell her something. Similarities to Lady Macbeth aside, during cross-examination of Zona's mother, the trial took its most dramatic turn. Shu's defense attorney, believing he could discredit Mary Jane, asked, "Mrs. Hester, isn't it true that you claim to have seen your daughter's ghost?" Gasps and murmurs could be heard throughout the courtroom, and then a hush fell over the court as Mary Jane calmly recounted her story. Driven by grief and suspicion, Mary Jane had been praying fervently every night for 4 weeks, begging for her daughter to return and reveal the truth about her death. According to Mary Jane, her prayers were answered in a most extraordinary way. Over the course of 4 dark nights, the spirit of Zona Shu appeared at her mother's bedside. The apparition would first manifest as a bright light, then take form, chilling the air in the entire room. Zona's ghost woke her mother and explained over and over again how Edward Shu had murdered her. The spirit told her mother that Shu had been abusive and cruel, attacking Zona in a fit of rage because he thought she hadn't cooked any meat for supper. In a horrifying demonstration, the ghost turned its head completely around, showing how Shu had savagely broken Zona's neck. It was at this moment that the defense attorney realized that his strategy had backfired spectacularly. By opening the door and introducing this haunting testimony himself, he made it admissible evidence. The jury, rather than ridiculing Zona's mother, was spellbound, listening as Mary Jane described her otherworldly visitations in vivid detail. Mary Jane said that Zona's spirit was cold, so cold it chilled the whole room. Zona told her mother that she wanted justice, that she couldn't rest until the truth was known. After Mary Jane stepped down, the prosecution called Dr. Knapp back to the stand, this time to testify about the results of Zona's exhumation and autopsy. The prosecution was not basing its case solely on the spectral evidence of Zona's ghostly visitations. This would have otherwise amounted to hearsay, an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. Following Zona's death, Mary Jane had approached the local prosecutor, John Preston, who listened to her account for several hours. Preston was aware that Mrs. Hester wasn't the only one in the community harboring suspicions about Zona's death. Even the local newspapers had mentioned that members of the community had been speculating as to the cause of Zona's death, and rumors were spreading. Preston went to see Dr. Knapp, who admitted that his initial examination of Zona had been cursory and incomplete. The two agreed that an autopsy was necessary to answer the lingering questions about Zona's death once and for all. On February 22, 1897, Zona's grave was opened. The autopsy was performed in the nearby Nickel schoolhouse, with an inquest jury of 5 men assembled to watch the proceedings. Even Edward Shue was required to attend, despite his vigorous complaints about the exhumation. One witness even testified to hearing Shue say, when he was ordered to attend the postmortem, that he knew he would be arrested, but that no one could prove him guilty of murder. Dr. Knapp testified in court that upon closer examination, he found that Zona's neck had been broken between the first and second vertebrae. The windpipe was crushed, and there were finger marks on her throat. The injuries were consistent with strangulation and a violent twisting of the neck. The doctor's testimony corroborated the ghostly account in chilling detail. The defense, visibly shaken, attempted to discredit the autopsy findings, but to no avail. As the trial neared its end, Edward Shue took the stand in his own defense. Despite his eloquent testimony, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Shue's demeanor began to crack under cross-examination as well. When pressed about his past marriages, he became agitated and evasive. After a surprisingly short deliberation of only an hour, the jury returned with their verdict. Shue was found guilty of Zona's murder. 10 of the 12 jurors voted for Shue to receive the death penalty, but because it was not a unanimous decision, Shue was sentenced to life in prison. As he was led away, the courtroom buzzed with excited chatter. For perhaps the first and only time in American legal history, the testimony of a ghost had helped secure a murder conviction. But the story doesn't end there. Just days after the trial, on July 11, 1897, a group of 15 to 30 local men who disagreed with Shue only receiving a life sentence assembled to form a lynching party. Armed and carrying a rope, they headed towards the jail where Shue was being held to exact their own justice. It was only the quick thinking of Deputy Sheriff Dwyer that saved Shue's life. Dwyer hid Shue in the woods a mile from town until the mob could be dispersed. On July 14th, Shue was moved to the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville for his own safety. But his time there would be short. Just 3 years later, on March 13, 1900, Shue died during an epidemic that swept through the prison. Today, no trace of Edward Shue can be found. The prison commonly buried unclaimed remains in the nearby Tom's Run Cemetery, for which no records were kept until the 1930s. As for Mary Jane Hester, she lived to the age of 75, passing away in 1916. She never recanted her story about Zona's ghost and became something of a local legend in Greenbrier County. Today, a historical marker stands along Route 60 in Greenbrier County, commemorating this extraordinary case. It reads, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Hester Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from ghost helped convict a murderer." The Greenbrier ghost case remains a fascinating tale of the intersection between the supernatural and the legal system. It also stands as a testament to the notion that the truth cannot remain buried as long as the dead live on in the memories of their loved ones. Moreover, it's also not the only legal case from West Virginia that involved the use of spectral evidence. Almost half a decade before the Greenbrier ghost case, in 1853, John Gamble, a well-known and prosperous local, prepared for another visit to New Martinsville, Virginia, a small town nestled along the Ohio River. Gamble was known for his speculative nature and his fondness for a stiff drink. This summer's day would be no different. After selling some chattels, Gamble found himself $200 richer. He met Lem Mercer, a local farmer and a familiar face, at the local tavern. As the two men drank together, they made plans to head home along the river road, a route both men knew well. Gamble eventually became more inebriated than Mercer. As dusk fell, the two men stumbled out of the tavern and began their journey home. Eventually they parted ways, but Gamble never made it home that night. His family, worried and desperate, launched a search the next day, but their efforts were in vain. John Gamble had vanished. Days turned into weeks, and rumors spread among the townsfolk. Where could Gamble have gone? Was it a tragic accident, or something more sinister? The mystery deepened when weeks later, his body was discovered. It was lodged against some rocks in the river, miles downstream from where he was last seen. His body, partially disrobed and stripped of valuables, fueled suspicions of foul play. The community was divided. Some believed Gamble had simply fallen into the river in his drunken state, while others were convinced he had been murdered. The case went cold, as no solid evidence pointed to a culprit. Then, in early November, the town's focus shifted to a popular social event, a corn-husking festival. It was a time for work, play, and lots of cider. Young and old from surrounding farms joined in the festivities, including a group of young men from New Martinsville. Among them was John Heineman, the owner of a local tavern. After a night of mingling and merriment, Heineman and his companions decided to race back to town, driven by a wager for a jug of whiskey. Out of breath, he fell behind, eventually resting near a small ravine, a place that would soon become infamous. As Heineman sat catching his breath, he heard a noise behind him. Turning, he saw a figure in white, standing eerily still. He was mortified as the figure spoke, claiming to be the ghost of John Gamble. The apparition, according to Heineman, accused Lem Mercer of his murder before vanishing into the night. Still terrified, Heineman rushed back to town, his face pale and his body trembling. He described his ghostly encounter to his friends, who, despite their skepticism, could see the sincere fear in Heineman's eyes. The next morning, a group of townsfolk returned to the ravine. There, among the brush, they found items belonging to the murdered man, at least partially confirming Heineman's eerie tale. This discovery reignited the investigation, and Lem Mercer was arrested and charged with murder. The trial that followed became a spectacle, drawing crowds from far and wide. Mercer was defended by the esteemed judge Alpheus F. Haymond, while the prosecution was led by the father of a prominent local figure, Sepp Hall. The presiding judge was G. W. Thompson. Fun fact, Thompson would later resign from his judgeship during the Civil War, refusing to take the oath of office out of protest against West Virginia being established as its own state. West Virginia was the only state to form by splitting away from a Confederate state, and, along with Nevada, was one of the 2 states to be admitted to the Union during the Civil War. The trial was a battle of wits and words, with witnesses recounting their versions of events and character assessments of both Gamble and Mercer. The ghostly testimony of Heinemann added a supernatural twist that naturally captivated the public. Apparently, according to accounts from some trial-goers, there was one point in the trial where the ghost of John Gamble was called to take the stand. When he did not appear, he was held in contempt of court. Despite the eerie evidence and the community's suspicions, the jury ultimately found Mercer not guilty. A lack of concrete evidence meant Mercer could not be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. Though acquitted, Lem Mercer's life was forever tainted. He remained in New Martinsville, but his reputation was shattered. He lived a life of isolation, shunned by neighbors who still believed in his guilt. The ravine where Heinemann saw the ghost became known as Gamble's Hollow, a lasting reminder of the unsolved mystery and the spectral encounter that had stirred the town. As we reflect on these chilling trials, we're left to ponder. Was it truly Zona's restless spirit that brought her killer to justice? Or was it the unwavering conviction of a grieving mother? Why would one defendant receive life in prison and the other be acquitted despite similarities in the ghostly evidence against them? Arguably, the distinguishing feature was the existence or non-existence of forensic evidence to corroborate the claims of the victim's spirits. Legally speaking, the notion that spectral evidence was allowed to be heard in these court proceedings at all serves as a stark reminder of the law's dark and grotesque history, especially the witch trials that pervaded medieval courts and even took root in the American colonies, as demonstrated by historical events such as the Salem witch trials. Thank you for joining us for our finale episode of The Dark Docket. If you enjoy the show, please give us a like or leave us a review on whatever venue you tune in on. Also, if you know of any mysterious legal cases from history, feel free to write to us at darkdocket@gmail.com. We're always on the lookout for paranormal precedents to share. Until next time, remember, spirits do not necessarily exist solely for the purpose of terrifying us. Sometimes, they are conjured to seek justice and give voice to the voiceless.